I knew something was off the moment I saw the bright orange sticker slapped across the bow of my boat like a scarlet letter. Abandoned property subject to removal. Right there, peeling in the July sun, stuck on the side of the seacraft I'd taken out less than a week ago. I stood in my driveway, keys in hand, still in my hospital scrubs from a 14-hour shift, staring at the sticker like it had personally insulted me. The boat wasn't even on the street, it was parked neatly on my own gravel pad next to the garage, behind a locked chain. Coast Guard numbers clearly visible, trailer registered, everything by the book. That's when I saw her. Vanessa Jorkins, head of our HOA board, 50-something, bleach blonde helmet hair, oversized sunglasses, and probably the loudest walking shoes in the zip code. She strutted down the sidewalk with a clipboard like she was heading into battle. "Mr. Fairley," she called, teeth clenched in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've had several complaints about that watercraft being abandoned. It's an eyesore." I took a breath and walked toward her, trying not to let the exhaustion show. "Vanessa, I launched that boat last Saturday. I've got the updated Coast Guard registration and launch record. You can't just slap an abandoned property sticker on it." She tapped her pen against her clipboard like she was annoyed I dared to respond. "It's been sitting there for more than 72 hours. That violates HOA Ordinance 7B. And she added with a look of theatrical disgust, "It's attracting mosquitoes." "Mosquitoes?" I asked, blinking. "It's a fiberglass hull, not a bird bath." She waved her hand dismissively. "Regardless, if it isn't moved within 48 hours, we'll have it towed." "HOA rules are rules." I held up my phone. "You do realize I have GPS logs showing it was on the water last weekend, right? And the Coast Guard site shows my active registration." Vanessa's face twitched, just for a second, as if I'd said something she hadn't prepared for. "You can take it up at the next board meeting," she said, already walking away. "But don't be surprised if we assess a fine in the meantime." I stared at her retreating back, anger buzzing louder than the cicadas in the trees. She wasn't just power tripping, she was trying to set me up. But what she didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything, every HOA notice, every odd complaint. And now, with this bogus boat violation, she'd finally crossed the line. I unlocked the garage and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping for months. It was time to fight back. By the time the sun dipped low behind the oaks, I had pulled the folder from the back shelf in my garage, the one labeled HOA Shenanigans. What started as a petty paper trail had grown into something much more. Inside were copies of every notice I'd received since moving into the neighborhood 3 years ago. Fines for grass that was half an inch too tall, complaints about non-regulation porch lighting, and vague citations for unsightly equipment that always seemed to appear right before HOA elections. But tonight, I wasn't just reviewing. I was cross-referencing. Vanessa's latest stunt gave me a reason to dig deeper. I pulled up my launch logs from the marina timestamped, GPS tagged and printed them, then did the same for the registration record from the Coast Guard's database. Then, I checked the HOA's bylaws, which I had scanned into my laptop ages ago. There was no mention of a 72-hour rule for watercraft stored on private property. None. Boats had to be in good condition, registered, and stored in a designated area. Mine checked every box. Which meant Vanessa had either fabricated the rule or was applying one from a different section entirely. I flipped to a printout of the 2021 HOA board minutes. That's when something caught my eye, a footnote about a storage ordinance update that was never formally filed with the county. I cross-checked it with the county clerk's office website, nothing. No record of an ordinance change, no filed amendment. That made it unenforceable. I grabbed my camera and walked the few blocks to the community bulletin board near the clubhouse. Sure enough, a new flyer was posted dated 2 days ago with a bold header that read, "Reinforcement of storage rules, 72-hour limit." It was printed in the same font as the HOA newsletters, but there was no mention of a vote, no board signatures, no public notice period. Just a line that said, effective immediately. I took a photo. That's when I noticed something even more interesting, a faint watermark in the bottom corner. Dunwood Print Co. I knew that business. Local mom and pop shop. The owner, Dennis, used to be a patient of mine after a shoulder surgery. I made a mental note to stop by. Back home, I called my cousin Riley, a junior attorney who handled property disputes out in Tampa. I didn't need her to file anything yet, but I wanted her take. Sounds like she's making up rules wholesale, Riley said. If they didn't file the change with the county, it has no legal standing, and that sticker, if it damages your property, that's a liability issue. What if I can prove she's been selectively enforcing fake rules to target specific homeowners? I asked. Then you're looking at abuse of authority. Especially if any of those fines led to liens. How many other homeowners are dealing with this? That question rang in my ears long after the call ended. I'd always assumed I wasn't the only one getting nickel and dimed by the HOA, but I'd never asked. Now I would. The next morning, I left a stack of small flyers in every mailbox on my block. Simple and polite. Have you been fined or warned by the HOA for questionable reasons? I'd like to hear your story. Contact me at the email below. By evening, I had 16 replies. Some were vague. They told me my mailbox was too modern, but others were alarming. One neighbor had been fined $400 for unauthorized renovations after painting her shutters the exact same color they'd always been. Another had been threatened with legal action for parking a work van in his own driveway, despite no rule prohibiting it. The most disturbing came from a retired Air Force mechanic named George, who claimed the HOA had issued escalating fines for non-compliance until they placed a lien on his house. He showed me the paperwork. None of the violations were dated, and the signatures looked suspiciously similar. I asked George if he'd be willing to let me scan the documents. He agreed. The next day, I visited Dunwood Print Co. Dennis greeted me with a smile and a cautious hug. I hadn't seen him since his rehab ended. "Hey Doc, what brings you in?" I held up my phone and showed him the flyer from the bulletin board. "Did your shop print this recently?" He squinted. "Sure did. Vanessa brought that in Monday morning. Said it was urgent, paid cash. Weirdest part? She brought in a USB drive with the file already designed. Usually we do that in-house." "Do you still have the order record?" He nodded and pulled out a binder. There it was listed under her name, no HOA reference, cash payment, and a note. Rush order, no customer receipt needed. That was the crack I needed. She wasn't just overreaching, she was bypassing the proper process entirely. Back at home, I compiled everything into a single report: photos, documents, scanned complaints, Dennis's order record. I sent it to Riley. 3 days later, I received a letter, certified, from the HOA. Notice of escalating violation, failure to comply with storage restrictions. Immediate removal of non-compliant watercraft required. Fines will accrue at a rate of $50 per day. I took a photo of the letter and added it to the folder. Then I called the local news. Channel 7's Consumer Affairs team had a segment called Neighborhood Watchdogs. I spoke to a young reporter named Daria who was eager for something meatier than pothole complaints and restaurant closures. "Let me get this straight," she said. "You've got documentation proving the HOA is enforcing fake rules, selectively targeting residents and potentially forging lien paperwork?" "I've got timestamps, witness statements, and a business owner willing to talk on camera." She showed up the next day with a cameraman. I made sure George was home. We stood in his driveway while Daria interviewed us. When George described how the lien paperwork arrived with no court signature and no option for appeal, her eyes lit up like she'd struck gold. After filming, she leaned toward me. "If that lien is fake, that's not just unethical, that's criminal. Forging legal documents, that's a felony." That night, the teaser for the segment aired. The title, "When the Watchdogs Go Rogue, Local HOA Accused of Fraud." Vanessa didn't knock on my door, she didn't even leave a voicemail. But 2 nights later, a manila envelope appeared on my porch. Inside was a letter unsigned stating that the abandoned property citation had been rescinded in light of new information. No apology, no explanation, just a quiet retreat. I didn't stop. Riley helped me file a formal complaint with the state's Department of Business and Professional Regulation. George submitted a notarized affidavit. Others followed. We formed a neighborhood committee independent of the HOA and began holding open meetings at the rec center. Attendance grew each week. Then came the real bombshell. One of our neighbors, a quiet woman named Priya who worked in the county records office, came forward with something explosive. She'd found a discrepancy in the HOA's annual filings. The signatures on the last 2 years' elections were identical, down to the loops in the lowercase g to Kes. They hadn't held a real election in over 24 months. They'd been rubber stamping their own appointments. With that, we brought in the sheriff's office, not for a complaint. For a criminal referral. Forgery, document tampering, mail fraud turns out, when you fake liens and forge signatures on legal filings, the judicial system takes an interest. The sheriff's deputy assigned to the case interviewed over a dozen homeowners. He confirmed 3 instances of potentially forged lien notices. Vanessa and 2 other board members were subpoenaed for questioning. The HOA's next scheduled meeting was packed, not by residents but by news vans, and I wasn't done yet. The night after the news segment aired, our street felt different. Not just because of the quiet Vanessa's usual morning patrol in her obnoxious white crossover never happened, but because for the first time, neighbors were stopping to chat on sidewalks, comparing notes, trading copies of letters they'd dug out of drawers. It was like someone had turned the lights on in a room we'd been sitting in for years. I spent the evening scanning pages from a banker's box. George brought over HOA correspondence dating back nearly a decade. At the bottom of the stack was something oddly technical, a copy of an architectural approval form with 2 signatures and a watermark from an engineering firm called Ralston and Mendel. The problem? The firm had dissolved 5 years earlier. I flagged it. The next morning, Deputy Harrow from the sheriff's office knocked on my door. He was in uniform, but his tone was casual, almost apologetic, like he was walking into a mess he hadn't expected to find so deep. "You available for a few minutes?" he asked, glancing around the driveway. I motioned him inside. I had already cleared the dining table for exactly this kind of visit. He looked over the stack I had laid out photocopies, emails printed with metadata, and a spreadsheet I'd compiled showing the timeline of HOA fines versus actual rule changes. "I'll be honest," he said, pulling out a notepad. "We expected this to be a neighborly spat, but your documentation, this is above my pay grade." "What's the next step?" I asked. "We're passing it to the state attorney's office. There's enough here for a preliminary investigation. Especially with forged liens involved. That's not a civil issue anymore." I leaned back in the chair, the weight of months of frustration finally shifting. He paused, then added, "We also got a tip from someone inside the HOA. Someone claiming Vanessa and the treasurer were moving funds into a private account under the name Community Beautification Task Force. Know anything about that? I didn't. But I knew someone who might. I walked over to the home of Bernice, an elderly woman who'd been the HOA's secretary until she stepped down last fall. She'd always been polite but distant until now. When I asked her about the account, her face tightened. "They made me sign disbursement forms," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Said it was for landscaping upgrades, but I never saw a single invoice, no receipts, just amounts and account numbers. When I questioned it, they told me I was too old to understand the software. Would you be willing to speak to the state attorney's investigator?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, someone needs to." That afternoon, I received a call from Daria at Channel 7. They'd gotten a tip from a viewer who saw the segment, a former HOA board member from a nearby community who claimed Vanessa had served on their board too. and left after a financial audit found discrepancies. No one had pressed charges, but the HOA had quietly dissolved the board and restructured. As I listened, the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about power tripping over paint colors and lawn lengths. Vanessa had a pattern, a method, and she was used to getting away with it. I forwarded the tip to Deputy Harrow, who looped in the state attorney's fraud team. They tracked down the previous HOA's audit report, and within days, a subpoena was issued for Vanessa's personal and HOA financial records. Then came the turning point. The sheriff's office served a warrant at the HOA's storage unit, a beige metal container tucked behind the community pool fence. Inside, they found a desktop computer, dozens of unfiled notices, and 2 hard drives. One of those drives contained spreadsheets logging every homeowner's payments, fines, warnings, and most damning manual entries labeled "adjusted for enforcement." Next to each entry were initials: VJ and MF, the treasurer. The files showed that certain residents, mostly elderly or single, had been fined repeatedly and disproportionately. In several cases, it appeared fines were entered retroactively, months after alleged violations. I was called in to identify some of the documents I'd previously submitted. When I confirmed their authenticity, the fraud team added me to the witness list. 3 days later, Vanessa was arrested. The charges included multiple counts of fraud, forgery of legal documents, mail tampering, and criminal misappropriation of funds. The treasurer, Marcus Feldstein, was picked up the same day. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and hedges as the squad car pulled away. No one spoke, but no one was surprised either. The fallout came fast. The state attorney's office froze the HOA's accounts, pending a full audit. All current board members were suspended, and a court-appointed receiver was brought in to manage community affairs temporarily. We held a community meeting in the rec center. No news vans this time, just neighbors. People brought folding chairs and cookies. One man, a plumber named Ray, offered to mow the shared green spaces until the HOA was reorganized. A high school senior offered to redesign the outdated community website. Everyone pitched in. I stood up near the end of the meeting and looked around at the people I'd once only waved to in passing. "All it took was one sticker on a boat," I said. "But it was never about the boat. It was about control. And I think we're done letting someone else decide what kind of neighborhood this is." Applause broke out, not wild, just steady and honest. Within a month, we held a new board election, this time supervised by the county's mediation office. Every candidate had to present a written plan and financial transparency promise. Bernice returned as secretary. George agreed to serve as treasurer. I was asked to run for president, but I declined. I'd had enough of rules and meetings for now. Instead, I helped establish a new oversight committee made up of 5 residents who rotated every quarter. Their job was simple: make sure the board stayed honest, and the boat. I polished it that weekend and took it out again, this time with George and Bernice on board. We drifted out past the marina, cracked open some sodas, and watched the sun sink into the Gulf. For the first time in years, the water felt peaceful. Not because things were perfect, but because we'd taken back control of our own community. And no one was ever going to slap another fake sticker on any of our lives again. The week after Vanessa's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Lawn chairs began appearing on porches again. Kids rode scooters down sidewalks that had once echoed with hushed complaints. But beneath the calm, there was still unfinished business. George stopped by one evening with a folder tucked under his arm, and a look I hadn't seen before, focused, urgent. "Got a call from a woman named Linda," he said, lowering his voice. "Used to live over on Summerleaf. Said she moved because of the HOA. She's got something we need to see." We met Linda at a diner on the edge of town that still had jukeboxes and laminated menus. She was in her late 40s, dressed like someone who worked with her hands, and carried a canvas bag filled with documents. She wasted no time. "They tried to foreclose on me 3 years ago. she said. Claimed I owed over $9,000 in unpaid dues and fines. But I paid every quarter on the dot. When I asked for an itemized statement, they stalled for months. Then I got a court summons. She pulled out a yellowed envelope with a case number stamped on the front. Inside was a notice of default signed by someone named M. Feldstein. Her eyes narrowed. I showed up to court with every receipt I had. They never did. Judge dismissed the case, but not before I spent nearly $2,000 on legal fees. I sold the house 6 months later. George leaned forward. Did you ever file a complaint? Linda shook her head. I was just glad to be done with it. But seeing that news piece, I figured someone should know. She handed over a copy of the canceled checks and a letter from the judge confirming the dismissal. I scanned them carefully. What stood out wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. The foreclosure attempt had been filed under a shell management company, Clearwater Community Services LLC. Ever hear of this? I asked. Linda shrugged. They said it was the HOA's accounting partner. Back home, I dug into the LLC registration. It barely had a digital footprint, no website. No listed employees. Just a P.O. box downtown and an agent named M. Feldstein. I stared at the screen. He hadn't just been treasurer. He'd created an entire fake company to funnel claims through. I forwarded everything to the state attorney's office. Within 48 hours, investigators obtained a second warrant. This time, they seized files from a rented office space Feldstein kept under the radar. Inside, they found over 24 foreclosure packets, each bearing the name Clearwater Community Services. Many had never been filed. They were what the lead investigator later described as prefabricated leverage tools, ready-to-mail threats designed to scare homeowners into compliance. 4 of the victims had already sold their homes. The charges multiplied overnight: wire fraud, civil extortion, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The scope of it was staggering, but the fallout didn't stop at Vanessa and Feldstein. Documents retrieved from the office included email threads between Vanessa and a real estate broker named Garrett Lyle. The emails detailed a disturbing pattern. The HOA would target a property with fines, create pressure through threats of liens or foreclosure, and once the homeowner appeared desperate, Garrett would swoop in with a lowball offer. The term they used was soft flipping. The district attorney's office filed subpoenas for Garrett's transaction history over the past 5 years. On paper, he'd purchased 8 homes from members of our neighborhood, all sold under market value, all cleaned up and flipped within 6 months. The profit margins were enormous, and the HOA board had received donations from Garrett's business on 3 separate occasions under the guise of community revitalization support. When the charges were announced publicly, they included racketeering. That was the final domino. The state assigned a special prosecutor to oversee the case. A grand jury was convened, and within weeks, the entire old board was under investigation. The indictment extended to 2 more members who had quietly stepped down a year earlier, but were still named on financial disbursement records. In the meantime, our new board moved swiftly to protect the remaining homeowners. Bernice, now acting president, initiated a financial audit through a third-party forensic accounting firm. The results were worse than we imagined. Over $60,000 in community funds were unaccounted for. Landscaping vendors had been paid for work never done. Digital receipts showed invoices for non-existent repairs, some even billed on holidays when no work crews could have been on site. The board voted unanimously to freeze all further spending and shift control to a temporary court-appointed trustee until the audit was complete. I stood beside Bernice at the next community meeting, this time held outdoors in the park beneath strings of borrowed patio lights. Folding chairs filled the grass. People brought potluck dishes. It wasn't a meeting, it was a town hall. Bernice stepped up, her voice steady. For years, decisions were made behind closed doors and residents were kept in the dark. That ends today. We're forming a financial oversight committee open to any homeowner who wants to participate. We'll rotate leadership every 3 months so no one person holds too much power. A man in the crowd raised his hand. What about restitution? She nodded. The DA's office has assured us that if convictions are secured, they will pursue restitution for the community. That includes both financial recovery and, if possible, assistance for those who suffered property loss. Another hand. What happens to the HOA now? I stepped forward. We're not dissolving it. That's how this happened in the first place. People stopped paying attention. What we're doing is rebuilding it from the ground up with transparency and accountability. This is our neighborhood again, all of ours. Applause rippled through the crowd, not loud, but honest. Over the next few weeks, things changed fast. A community calendar went up online with events, maintenance schedules, and board meeting agendas posted in advance. The maintenance crew was rehired under a new contract, this time with performance verification built in. No more invisible work orders. The boat, still sitting on my gravel pad but this time with a laminated card in the window, proudly registered, proudly docked, proudly not abandoned. Every time I looked at it, I thought about how close I'd come to losing more than just a hobby. If I hadn't noticed that sticker, if I hadn't pushed back, it could have been my house, my equity, my name on one of those forged foreclosure packets. Vanessa eventually took a plea deal. So did Feldstein. Garrett fought the charges, but the paper trail was too clean, the victims too credible. He was convicted of fraud and conspiracy. The state seized assets from all three, including a lakefront rental property Feldstein had listed under a cousin's name. Proceeds from the seizures were earmarked for community restitution. Linder received a formal apology from the state and a refund for her legal expenses. She didn't move back, but she visited once with a tray of brownies and a smile that finally reached her eyes. The neighborhood changed not just in policies, but in how people treated each other. More porch lights stayed on after dark. Lawn chairs lingered a little longer into the evening. And when someone parked a trailer in their own yard, no one said a word, people waved again, not because things were perfect, but because they were ours. Nobody's property was ever marked abandoned again. And no one ever forgot how close we all came to losing control until one sticker pushed back.